Hi and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Discovery Season 1. In this video I'll review Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery as a whole. I will be examining the whole Season more on general and vague terms, so for more specific reviews on Discovery you can check out my individual episode reviews on my channel. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Star Trek Discovery up to the end of Season 1. If you haven't seen all of Season 1, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, Star Trek Discovery was a very controversial show. From the moment it was announced, it polarized Star Trek fans. Some really wanted the return of Star Trek to TV, and others didn't think it was a good idea as they were fearful after the reboots that this would be another cash grab action show that felt more like Star Wars and didn't hold to the principles of Star Trek. I myself felt a kind of cautious optimism, as having another Star Trek show is something I want very much, as I want to see the Star Trek universe expand, and the Star Trek is a franchise I think works best on TV. However, I was cautious because I had been burned twice with Enterprise and the reboots, as I was unhappy with the concept, but neither went in the direction that I thought that it should. When reports started coming in, I was reassured, as the showrunner would be Bryan Fuller, who was the showrunner for several successful TV shows like Hannibal, and even worked on Star Trek Voyager as a writer. It was also stated that it would take place in the Prime timeline, which was a huge relief, as that's the only real Star Trek timeline in my opinion, and I heard that it would be serialized and Season 1 would tell one story that would focus on a main character who is not the captain, which was exactly the kind of inventive direction I felt Star Trek needed to go in order to survive, rather than producing another carbon copy show of people sitting on the bridge and spouting out technobabble and offering nothing new in terms of storytelling a la Star Trek Enterprise. However, as time went on, doubts were introduced as well. Bryan Fuller dropped out as showrunner, and many were saying it was because CBS wanted to have the show take place in the Kelvin timeline, but I found out that actually wasn't the case, but CBS was insisting that the show look more like the reboots aesthetically. Also, I found out it would take place 10 years before the original series, which wasn't the post-Voyager setting I was hoping for, as this would make it yet another prequel, which is always a tricky thing. And then the air date of the show kept getting pushed back, and they cited a lot of production issues for the reason for doing this, and that is actually never a good sign. So, when it first aired, I was still cautiously optimistic, where a large portion of the Star Trek fan base had apparently already decided that the show would be a travesty, and many had this belief reaffirmed when the show would air. But me, I like to say I was more open-minded to the show. I have said and still maintain that the Abrams reboot films are not Star Trek because they don't hold to the ideal of Star Trek, they don't have the feel of Star Trek, and are more action-based CGI explosion fests that just steal the names of pre-existing Star Trek characters who bear no resemblance to them. However, many were saying that Discovery was not Star Trek because of its bleak setting, its unlikable characters who seemed morally gray, and rather being about exploration, it was about war. However, I had no issue with this, as there are many unlikable Starfleet officers throughout all incarnations of Star Trek, from Garth Vizar to Admiral Pressman to Admiral Layton to Captain Ransom. And Discovery is not, in fact, the first Star Trek series to be set during wartime, as the final 2 seasons of Deep Space Nine took place during the Dominion War, and moreover, wars were mentioned and sometimes shown in all Star Trek series, such as Starfleet going to war against the Klingons in the original series episode Errand of Mercy, and other historical wars being mentioned, such as the war with the Romulans, the war with the Cardassians, and their conflict with the Borg sometimes was described as a war, not to mention the brief war with the Xindi featured in Star Trek Enterprise. So I would argue that Discovery has not shown anything that we haven't already seen in Star Trek before. We perhaps focus more on it, but I personally love the idea as we focus on elements that are established to exist in the Star Trek universe, but we simply never focused on them before, which to me is the new and fresh idea that is what Star Trek needs. However, that being said, I didn't feel Discovery was perfect, as I had my own issues with it as well, most notably the makeup change for the Klingons, which, yes, has been pointed out that Klingons and other aliens have undergone makeup changes before. This one, however, is too drastic of a change, or of a too iconic and established look that, in my opinion, makes it far, far worse than any makeup change seen in Star Trek previously. But not only that, the behavior and demeanor of how the Klingons are portrayed seem completely different as well, which makes one wonder why they simply didn't introduce a new alien race. I and many others have a hard time thinking of these Uruk-hai-looking monsters as Klingons, and thus a hard time fathoming that this links up to established canon. And while in general I believe some Star Trek fans' cries of Discovery violating canon is baseless, and is nothing worse than anything any previous Star Trek show has done before and gotten away with it. There were times when Discovery did what the producers refer to as skirting canon that kind of irritated me. For example, having the Vulcan that fostered our main character, Michael Burnham, be an established character, Sarek, I think was a mistake and something done for the purposes of fan service, and would have been better had it been a new Vulcan character. While I don't think this violates canon, as some would claim, as the possibility that Spock had a foster sister was never mentioned before, but it still certainly exists. After all, he had a half-brother that was revealed in Star Trek V that we never heard of before, so that's not a canon violation. But just like the Sybok reveal, it is simply bad writing. Now, some may find my stance on Discovery being Star Trek, but the Abrams reboots not being Star Trek a bit contradictory, but to me, there's a clear difference between Discovery and the Abrams reboots films. Note, I don't include Star Trek Beyond in that bunch of films, as that film actually did come off as a Star Trek film, but the difference between Discovery and those first two films is clear. Discovery, although having a similar aesthetic look and being action-packed, takes place in a real and tangible universe and has rules to that universe that it abides by that makes sense, where the reboot films do not. Anything could happen as long as it serves the plot, such as cadets instantly being promoted to captain and a magical cure that can bring people back to life. Discovery does have a clear universe and characters who behaved in keeping with established Starfleet and Federation traits. And in the end of the season, the show proved that the main theme was in keeping with Star Trek's sensibility of always trying to make peace the final solution. In fact, I would argue Star Trek Discovery is no less Star Trek than Deep Space Nine is. And also, Discovery never featured any damned product placement, so that right there makes it more Star Trek than the reboots. However, that being said, there were moments to Discovery that didn't fit the theme of Star Trek. However, I wouldn't point to these moments to say, haha, this proves Discovery isn't Star Trek, but rather would point to them as specific cases of bad writing, where the writers were more concerned with pushing the plot forward rather than staying true to the depiction of Starfleet and the Federation. One such example is when a Starfleet security officer allows two inmates to attack another inmate and just sits back and lets this attack happen. This is unacceptable under any circumstance and nothing any actual Starfleet security officer would ever do. Also, anyone who watched my episode of reviews would know I had a huge problem with the way Saru tortured, to the point of death, a living creature when his officers brought up the possibility that this creature that he was torturing was sentient, and actually pointed out, hey, what you're doing is akin to the cruelest kind of torture and is eventually going to kill it. He refused to listen to them and instead brought up personal issues he had with the crew member in question, which are completely irrelevant, making him not only a terrible commander, but someone who by all rights should have been court-martialed and thrown into prison for his actions, and yet he faced no consequences whatsoever. However, his character was later redeemed in the season when he continually stood up for Starfleet principles and formed a bond with his crew, proving that he was a good captain. And while this comes off as inconsistency in his character, I see it more as that one episode was just poorly written, as they were more concerned with pushing the character conflict with Saru and Burnham forward and not realizing that they were presenting him as an incompetent sociopath. Now, another strike I heard against Discovery was that some were complaining that it was presenting the Klingons as an analogy for Trump and Trump supporters, when previously they were used as an analogy for tensions in the Cold War. And some even went as far to say that this proves that Discovery was not Star Trek. Now, this is a criticism I could not possibly disagree with more, as Star Trek has always been about making commentary relevant to the time that it was airing. As for the original series, they would make commentary on the threat of nuclear war and the Cold War, as well as the civil rights movement of the 60s. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager would make commentary relevant to the 90s, such as environmental concerns, Wall Street greed, drug addiction, discrimination against homosexuals, and the treatment of the poor and homeless. Enterprise made commentary on issues relevant to the early 2000s, such as 9/11, discrimination against Muslims, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So nothing could be more Star Trek than making commentary relevant to the time that it's made in, which for today is mostly Trump, Brexit, and other movements that seem isolationist in nature and that try to distance themselves from people they consider to be others. And I think Discovery does this amazingly well by having the main Klingon adversary being someone who violently opposes integration and cooperation of different species and sees it as pollution of their culture. Further, the Mirror Universe storyline also makes commentary on this by focusing on the evil version of humanity, the Terran Empire, which is isolationist, racist, and sees any non-human race as inferior. In fact, a writer for the show once noted that he thought the Mirror Universe was the perfect analogy for today's social situation, as with things like Trump getting elected and Brexit passing, it sometimes feels like we're living in a Mirror Universe. So in that way, I think this makes Discovery incredibly Star Trek by making social commentary on issues relevant to modern times, and nothing could be more Star Trek than that. So, getting more into the season as a whole, I do think there are parts of it that worked and parts that didn't. Most people took issue with the first two episodes, stating they felt it was unnecessary and disjointed as it takes place before Discovery is introduced, but I very strongly disagree, especially after seeing the entire season, where I feel it was vital to see things like Burnham's relationship to Captain Georgiou, how she became disgraced, and the origin of the Klingon movement under T'Kuvma, which introduced vital characters like Valk and L'Rell. However, I could see how the first set of episodes after that kind of meandered and felt unfocused. Most people agree that the season's strongest point was the Mirror Universe story arc that began in the season's second half after a several-month break. I personally felt this ramped up the quality of the show overall and turned it from something that was decent and I was somewhat interested in into a high-quality show where I couldn't wait to see what happened next. Although I did have some issues with the Mirror Universe arc, for the most part I found this was one of the best several episode story arcs in the entire Star Trek franchise. However, that being said, the 2-episode arc that followed it and closed out the season I was less impressed with. Although I didn't think it was horrible, it did seem kind of rushed and it didn't have that high quality that the Mirror Universe arc had. But looking back on the season as a whole, the pacing felt really off and disjointed. The first half of the season felt directionless and seemed to meander, whereas the second half had a clear direction, but it felt rushed. So it seems like the season would benefit overall had the pacing been better and flowed more. This, I think, is where the production problems that the show was having before it started really showed. Where things like losing Bryan Fuller and the fact that the production kept having to be delayed, in fact, they kept changing the number of episodes that they were going to have, it makes it show that they didn't really have all their ducks in a row. While they did have a clear story that they were telling about a disgraced Starfleet officer finding redemption, that I think does come together nicely in the end, with some story beats such as the Mirror Universe, which were set up for very nicely from the start. But its execution was a bit sloppy and disjointed. That being said, this does make me more hopeful for a season 2, as it shows the kind of potential that the show has, and that I have no doubt that they'd be able to do a better job when given proper time to do so and no longer have to deal with all these production issues. Also, season 1 could be a huge learning curve in that regard, so it has I'm a lot more hopeful that the show can only get better from here. Now, getting more specifically into the characters the show was based on, overall I would say that this was a strong point of the show. And another key component of the best Star Trek series is that of having a strong, interesting cast of characters. And in that regard, I think Discovery succeeded in spades. First off, there was the disgraced Starfleet Commander Michael Burnham, whose character arc I thought played out really nicely, as she began as a human raised by Vulcans learning to be human again, and then progressed to a disgraced criminal having to prove her worth, and along the way falling in love for the first time with a man who turns out to be a Klingon spy, and by the end of it realizing that the best way to save the Federation is by upholding its key principles of peace and understanding rather than rejecting them, which is a character story I thought played out very nicely. There's also Captain Lorca, who was indeed a very strong character with a dark past and a hidden agenda, but to be honest, I did feel that the revelation that this character was from the Mirror Universe the whole time and didn't really care at all about the Klingon War or Burnham, and was just using them for his own purposes to conquer the Terran Empire. This actually made his character less interesting to me and felt like a contrived way for the writers to have a gotcha moment rather than a complex story arc. There's also Saru, who, as I said, I had some major issues with in the first half of the season, but the second half I feel came together as a complex character who was willing to forgive his worst enemy and able to form a bond with a disenfranchised crew in order to pull them out of the roughest of situations. Lieutenant Ash Tyler, who also turned out to be the Klingon Valk, his struggle with the revelation I thought played out really nicely and was set up for beautifully. This was a really dynamic character who was in part a villain, and that duality within him made him a fascinating addition to the cast. And also, Lieutenant Stamets, the first openly gay main cast member of the Star Trek show, who began as a cretin who was just rude to everyone. He also grew to make bonds with the crew and became an integral component to the Spore Drive, but used it in a way that upheld the principle of Starfleet. Then there's Cadet Tilly, who was probably the best use of a young green officer learning to find her way in Starfleet that Star Trek has ever done. Her relationship with Burnham I thought worked really well, as both characters grew and learned from this relationship, and she did bring some effective comic relief. And also Dr. Colburn, who was a compassionate character whose death was very powerful felt, and is very effective on Stamets' character in ways I hope we continue to see. And also, there was the bridge crew, whom I saw many complain about, as these were characters that weren't explored at all during the season. However, I was perfectly fine with them because I thought it was wise of the show to focus more on the main cast. And I love the fact that the bridge crew did remain consistent and we actually learned their names rather than it just being a random mess of extras who appear and disappear. I think this allows for the opportunity for these characters to be developed more in future seasons, which I suspect they will do. In fact, I find that kind of brilliant that they held off on doing so, as if they tried to develop all of these characters at the same time, like, Stamets and Saru, and then all these other characters as well, the show could have very easily got bogged down as coming off as trying to do too much. So I'm actually happy with it, but I hope to see more of them in the future. So my rating for Star Trek Discovery Season 1 out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. I've got to be honest, the Mirror Universe arc alone elevates this from a 7 to an 8, as by itself, it was absolutely amazing and one of the best arcs done in all of Star Trek. And there were other great moments in Season 1 as well, such as the well-executed character journey of Michael Burnham, the wonders of the Spore Drive, and the revelation of the Klingon Infiltrator. That being said, the overall pacing of the season was all over the place and wasn't put together very well. Episodes in the first half of the season were unnecessarily slow or didn't need to exist at all, where episodes in the second half were too rushed and would have been improved had we spent more time on them. Also, the revelation that Lorca was from the Mirror Universe, I felt, detracted rather than added anything to the overall character stories of the show, which, while some character arcs like Tilly, Burnham, Stamets, and Tyler really worked, others like Saru were a bit more problematic and jumbled. So overall, a great start, but a lot of room for improvement that I hope to see. So that's it for my review of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery. Be sure to keep an eye on my channel as I continue to cover many Star Trek shows, as well as covering other shows like Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.